Good.
Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second in the series of Earth in Brackets presenting towards the road through COP. Today we have with us another honored guest. We have Sivan Kartha from the Stockholm Environment Institute and from the SERP project as well. He is an IPCC author and senior scientist, as I said, at Stockholm Environment Institute. I'm Nathan Thankey. I am the focal point for the Global North for the youth constituency at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations. Thank you to Sergio from Earth in Brackets for setting this up and for guiding us with the technical elements to it. The webinar will last approximately 1 hour, and we will have time for a Q&A via the Google Hangouts Q&A or via Twitter. You can direct your questions to @EarthInBrackets, and we'll pick them up from Twitter or from the Google Hangouts Q&A. So without taking up too much more time in these introductions, I'd just like to turn it over to Sivan, and I'd like to say that it is really an honor for us to be presented with, again, we're very lucky in this series. We had Yokeling speak on the history of the UNFCCC very, very lucidly and very concisely, which was some sort of miracle. And we're again going to have another lucid and concise speaker in Sivan. If you don't know this man, he is a brain box, a sort of guru in many ways of equity and of how to turn equity and what sounds to many as a sort of financial term into actually an understandable element of what it means to call for climate justice, and particularly to call for climate justice in the context of the UN climate change negotiations. So amongst his body of work, I think he's quite one of the leading thought leaders on greenhouse development rights framework, as well as what is now, I guess, commonly called a sort of fair shares methodology towards calculating equity. So I'll turn it over to you, Sivan, and Sivan today is also going to be presenting a slideshow, so he will be sharing his screen with us for that purpose. And thank you again, Sivan, for this.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Nathan. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. You flatter me. I think really what most can be said about me is that I've chosen the right topic. Equity and climate change is something that has just become terribly important and more in the minds and on the radars of people all over, civil society, as well as negotiators, anyone who's concerned about climate, really. And I think there are two reasons why that's true. The first reason is that equity is a good thing. We want to have a fair system. We want to have a fair arrangement. We want to come up in Paris with an agreement that people think of as fair. It's just a good thing. It's an objective in and of itself. But there's another reason, and that's even for people who aren't too concerned about fairness, but who are concerned about actually saving the climate, who are concerned about their own countries and their own children and their own grandchildren. Fairness is important for them too, because this immense climate challenge is a global challenge. It's a common problem that we all share, and the only way to share it, the only way to address this problem, to solve this problem, to actually rise to the challenge, is if it's done fairly. And that's because no country can solve their own climate problem. No country can reduce its emissions, no matter how quickly, and thereby save their own climate, prevent it from being catastrophically disrupted. And that's because for every country, their own emissions are only a small part of the problem. And their climate is being disrupted overwhelmingly by the rest of the world, by all the other countries out there. So, and this is true even of the largest countries and the countries that are emitting the most. It's true of the U.S. It's true of China. It's true of the EU as a group. It's true of India. It's true of all countries. Their emissions are only a small portion of what ultimately is the cause of their climate disruption. It's the emissions of all countries. So when a country reduces its emissions, it's not really to save its climate. A country reduces its emissions, maybe there are some co-benefits, and we can definitely help clean up the our own cities and improve the air quality by reducing emissions. But after a certain point, a country only reduces its emissions not to save its climate, but to convince the rest of the world, its partners, its negotiating counterparts, that it's doing its fair share. It's part of this global cooperative effort in order to convince other countries that it's making a contribution, and it's time for all other countries to do so too. This was expressed by the IPCC in its most recent assessment report, when it pointed out that agreements that are seen to be fair are more likely to actually work. And so we talked today about equity, one, because it's a good thing and we want an agreement that's fair, and two, because ultimately that's really the only way that we can have an agreement that works. I'm going to shift over now to the presentation. I have a number of slides to show. Nathan, can you tell me if that's visible and looks good and the whole slide is on there?
That is working just fine.
Okay, very good. So I'm going to start by referring to two big studies that have just come out that were meant to assess the pledges that countries have put forward in preparation for this Paris negotiation, and ultimately really as the bulwark of the agreement that is supposed to arise from Paris. So roughly 170 countries now, I think, have put forward pledges, Paris pledges, telling other countries what they plan to do as their contribution to this global effort. The United Nations Environment Program has done an assessment of these pledges, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat has done an assessment of these pledges, and they've come to the same conclusion. And they've both concluded that ultimately, when you add up all the effort on the table, the amount of mitigation that countries have offered to do falls well short of what is actually needed to hold warming below 2 degrees. The pledges, by and large, were mitigation pledges for the year 2030, and the amount of mitigation that countries have offered to do is well less than half of what ultimately will be required in 2030. So we have a long way to go. Both the United Nations Framework Convention Secretariat and the United Nations Environment Program point out that there's real effort reflected in these pledges. We are starting to make a dent in the emissions rise, but ultimately this isn't anywhere near what's necessary. And in fact, if what we get out of Paris is nothing more than the pledges, then we will still actually see emissions continuing to rise globally between now and 2030. That was two assessments that was done, both of them released within the past month. There's a third assessment that was done, which came to very much the same conclusion, that there is a lot more that needs to be done. The pledges, as they've been put forward by all the countries that are members of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, are not sufficient, but it went a step further. And it looked not only at altogether what have countries offered to do and is it enough globally, but they looked at individual countries, country by country, to determine whether the amount of mitigation that that country has put forward, how does it compare to what it should put forward? What would be its fair share? What would be its equitable contribution to this global effort? And so what I'm going to do in this presentation is to focus very much on the approach and the analysis and the outcomes that came from that civil society equity review the third of these assessments of the pledges. First thing I'll say is that it was really quite perhaps an unprecedented coalition that came together to do this very broad civil society equity review. It was a wide range of organizations. It really was quite a diverse range. Some of them were based in the north, some of them are based in the south, some of them have been historically focused on environmental issues, conservation, ecological issues, and some of them have been primarily focused on social justice issues and developmental issues. There are the International Trade Union Confederation, for example, is focused on labor issues. It was an encouragingly broad set of groups that came forward to do this, and an even broader and more diverse and really quite numerous set of groups that then ultimately signed on to the report and in support of the method, the findings, and the messages that came out of it. So what this group fundamentally was aiming to do was to answer, how do you equitably share the global effort of preventing a climate catastrophe? And in particular, it was looking at the side of reducing emissions. How do you equitably share the global effort of reducing emissions? What you see here is a chart showing global emissions steadily rising over time from the beginning of the century to 2030, according to typical projections. This is consistent with IPCC scenario database, for example. And what you also see here is a pathway corresponding to what would need to happen to emissions globally if we were to have a decent chance of keeping warming below 2 degrees. That's the lower line. Emissions are heading off towards 60 or 70 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and emissions by 2030 would need to go down toward the 30 billion tons range. The big blue area, this big blue wedge, represents the emissions reductions that will need to happen in the next 15 years. In 2030, that corresponds to some 35 billion tons of reductions. And so the question is, how should those reductions, the effort of making them, be distributed among countries? Making those reductions involves a vast deployment of renewable energy technologies and energy efficiency. It requires investments. It requires policies. It requires significant institutional efforts in order to actually make this happen. It requires significant technological deployment and certainly financial investments as well. So the question is, how should that be fairly shared among countries? And that's the aim of this exercise of these civil society organizations, to ask the question, how should that be, that 35 billion tons of reductions by 2030 be shared among countries? The approach it takes is to start with a basic set of equity choices. Equity decisions that are really sort of the type of ethical questions that we as political citizens grapple with all the time when thinking about policy issues. From there, to translate them into a set of quantitative indicators based on the kind of data that countries always use to kind of reflect their economic, financial, environmental, human developmental situation. And from there, to define a set of national fair shares corresponding to, driven by the quantitative indicators and ultimately based in the equity choices that were made by the group. Now, as I've mentioned, the group of civil society organizations engaged in this exercise was a very broad group. And it can't really be expected, given that equity really does have a fundamentally value-based normative dimension to it, that all of these groups would see precisely eye to eye and would have exactly the same sensibility about what equity means and what fair shares would be and how much a given country should do. So what the group decided to do was not to try and come to a single definition of equity, but to acknowledge the fact that there are a range of views of equity, and to consider a broad span of equity perspectives and look at the implications of that broad span for national fair shares of the effort. So a range of beginning assumptions about what's equitable and what's the right amount of ambition led to, for each country, a range of possible fair shares of what they should do of the global effort, an equity range. And so I'll be talking in more detail about what were the questions that they grappled with when trying to think about the fundamental equity questions and how that translated into a range of possible fair shares for these countries. The starting point for pretty much any discussion of equity in the climate world is Article 3 of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which says, and this is quoted at virtually every negotiation by many parties, the parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And many of you may have heard that phrase. It's been invoked countless times over the course of time since the Framework Convention was drafted. What you may not know is that this is actually a sort of a brief and shortened version of what was more explicitly laid out and agreed also in 1992, when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed within the Rio Declaration. The Principle 7 of the Rio Declaration, also signed in 1992, to which most countries of the world are signatories by a large margin, reads, in view of the different contributions to global environmental degradation, states have common but differentiated responsibilities. The developed countries acknowledge the responsibility that they bear in the international pursuit of sustainable development in view of the pressures their societies place on the global environment and of the technologies and financial resources they command. It makes very clear this longer and more elaborated statement that what's referred to when one refers to common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities is the relative amount of contribution that you have for the problem, responsibility you have for causing the climate change problem, and the relative amount of financial and technological wherewithal you have to help solve the problem. It was probably not put in any clearer a way than it was expressed by former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, in a New York Times op-ed piece when he wrote, countries will be asked to meet different requirements based upon their historical share or contribution to the problem and their relative ability to carry the burden of change. This precedent is well established in international law, and there's no other way to do it. It's well established in international law. It's well established in domestic law as well. Within our own countries, we have a very strong, shared, virtually universal, and intuitively felt sense that, all else being equal, people should contribute to solving a problem in proportion to how much they had to do with creating that problem. If you make a mess, you're responsible for cleaning it up. We also have a strong shared sense that, all else being equal, people should contribute to solving a problem in proportion to their own capacity to do so. When we have, for example, public costs that need to be borne, like the infrastructure that we all use, the road infrastructure, the various public amenities that we rely on, or if there are public benefits to be shared, it's done in a way that takes into account how much income you have to contribute. When taxes are collected, our income taxes tend to be progressive. The less income you have, the smaller a share you're expected to give. A dollar of a poor person is not counted for the purposes of collecting public taxes the same way that the millionth dollar of a rich person. We tend to think of of contributions to dealing with public costs in a progressive sense. Progressive not in progressive versus conservative, but progressive in the economist sense of progressive taxation versus regressive taxation. Progressive meaning puts more of the burden onto the richest. And so what was quickly decided by the civil society groups engaged in this exercise was that lots can be said about equity. There are lots of different questions to answer. There are lots of different perspectives. But from the standpoint of the climate negotiations, from the standpoint of sharing the global burden of addressing climate change, there really are two overwhelmingly important and also contentious and often fought over dimensions of equity. The first of those two is historic responsibility. If we're talking about a country's contribution to the climate problem, their contribution since when? How far back in time should we consider that contribution? Should it be from the first days that we started cutting down forests, or should it be only back until 1992 when the ink was drying on the UNFCCC and there was a legal obligation to do something about it? And lots of arguments can be had about what's the right amount of time one should go back and count a country's emissions towards its responsibility. The second dimension, which relates to capabilities, is how progressive should we interpret the notion of capabilities. Some countries have more progressive taxation than others. Some countries have put much more of the tax burden on, say, the poorer middle classes than other countries, which put most of it on the wealthier classes. And there are fundamental equity differences about how progressive a system should be. So these are the two fundamental dimensions that were considered by this group. There are many other issues that could be discussed, but these were the ones that were seen to be most important from the standpoint of the equity debates within the climate regime. So let me say something about historic responsibility. What you see here on this chart is a graph from the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, Working Group 3, showing emissions going back from the present to 1750. It's broken up by different major regions of the world. And you see also here three specific milestones, 1850, 1950, 1990. And just for your own reference, the amount of emissions of the total that have been emitted since 1850 is almost all of it. It's about 95% of emissions. The amount of emissions that have been emitted since 1950 is about 2/3 of the total. The amount of emissions that have been emitted since 1990 is about 1/3 of the total. So in trying to figure out how important historic responsibility is and how far back in time should we go before in order to account for a country's contribution to the problem, the civil society organizations engaged in this exercise thought about the range of dates, thought about the share of the total emissions that would be taken into account if you went back to 1990 versus 1950 versus 1850 versus before that. It thought about issues such as who was benefiting at that point, and are there benefits that still accrue to the current population based on emissions that were emitted a long time ago. In some cases, the answer may be no. In other cases, the answer may be yes, they are still benefiting, because those emissions arose in the creation of infrastructure that's still being used now. Roads, buildings, agricultural land that's still being used. The decision that the civil society organizations came to was that a reasonable bounding of an equity of historic responsibility for the purpose of this exercise that could be considered fair, that could be considered a reasonable equity range, was from 1850 to 1950. 1850 is roughly when the Industrial Revolution was indeed underway, and countries were starting to benefit significantly in the form of industrialization and increasing wealth. 1950 was seen at a point where there was definitely infrastructure being built. There are still benefits being accrued from emissions that were emitted then, and that accounts for at least 2/3 of emissions. So that range, 1850 to 1950, was considered to be a reasonable equity range from the standpoint of accounting for a country's historic responsibility. The civil society groups also acknowledged and recognized that there are other dates that are still politically salient within the negotiations. They're still raised as being relevant. 1990 specifically. 1990 being the time at which, okay, we had an IPCC that was drafting its first report. We had the negotiations toward the UNFCCC underway. So even though the civil society groups did not consider that to be really fair, since it ignores such a large amount of emissions, including much of the emissions that went to create current infrastructure, it was interested, the coalition was interested in seeing what would be the implications of using 1990 as the definition of historic responsibility. How would it change the definition of different countries' fair shares? And so I'll be showing that. How does it compare to what the coalition agreed was a reasonable equity range, going back to 1950 or as far back as 1850? So that's on the side of historic responsibility and the one main dimension that the civil society organizations considered. The other had to do with progressivity and capacity. And to explain how this is relevant, let me go again to the IPCC, and in particular to figure from Chapter 6, showing the year at which greenhouse gas emissions will need to peak and start falling in order to keep warming below 2 degrees in each of 5 major regions. The OECD countries since 1990, which is basically North America, Canada and the US, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Latin America, Middle East and Africa, and the economies in transition, former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. And the first row here shows the time period during which those regions' emissions would roughly need to peak and start to decline. For the developed countries, OECD 90, the time period is really already 2010. Emissions should be peaking and declining. And for many OECD, many developed countries, that was the case, actually. Several have started reducing their emissions since 1990. Much more can be said about the causes for that, but that in many countries has been seen to take place. Asia, the date that emissions will need to peak and start to decline to keep warming on a 2-degree pathway was roughly 2020. Latin America, 2015. Middle East, Africa, 2020, and the economies in transition roughly now, 2015. In other words, in order for us to keep warming below 2 degrees, likely to stay at below 2 degrees, global emissions would need to peak, and also emissions in all regions would need to peak within roughly the next 10 years. That's what would be necessary if warming were to be likely to stay below 2 degrees. Peak and start to fairly rapidly decline. In other words, a broad, low greenhouse gas transformation underway in all regions. Now, all regions means regions that really vary quite widely in terms of their level of development, in terms of the current level of development, but even in terms of their level of development when emissions would need to peak in that region. Let me shift to a chart that shows the income per capita in several representative countries when their emissions would need to peak. The blue bars correspond to a number of countries in either OECD 90 or the economies in transition. It shows their income in 2010. The red bars correspond to countries of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. and it shows their projected income in the time period from 2015 to 2025, when their emissions would need to peak. So there are a few things to say about this. One is the blue countries, the developed countries, their incomes do span quite a broad range. Norway's income, for example, is roughly a factor of 6 more than Ukraine's income in 2010. So it is, in many ways, a quite heterogeneous group, the developed countries. The same can be said for the developing countries. It's quite a heterogeneous group. It varies from South Korea, for example. Singapore would have an even higher per capita GDP, to the LDCs, the least developed countries, which have a much lower GDP. And all of these countries would need to be figuring out how to make their emissions peak and start to decline. All of these countries across this wide range of incomes. Another thing to say is that the developed countries, by and large, do have significantly lower incomes at the time that their emissions would need to peak. And for your reference, the dark part of the bar shows the range of projected incomes using very standard economic forecasts like those from the International Monetary Fund. The range of their projected incomes from 2015 at the lowest end to 2025. So China's, for example, would be from roughly 7,000 or so to close to 20,000, 19,000, 18,000 dollars per capita, and these are all in purchasing power parity terms. So it takes into account the actual purchasing power of their money within their country, given the relative cost of goods. So it can be seen that developed countries, by and large, have much higher emissions when their emissions needed to peak and start, much higher incomes when their emissions needed to peak and start to decline, and the developing countries much lower incomes. Even taking, say, China, for example, whose growth has been and is expected to continue to be quite rapid, its income is on the order of, somewhere between maybe a sixth and a half or so of that of, say, the United States or Norway. Other countries such as Indonesia, India, much lower, roughly, say, $5,000 or so, when its emissions would need to peak, compared to the United States' 40-some thousand dollars. $5,000 represents a very different stage of development, a very different set of needs. Infrastructure is still being built. Electricity is still being provided to communities that don't have electricity. Roads are still being built. Healthcare facilities are still being expanded. Schools are still being expanded. For reference, $5,000, which is the rough range that Indonesia and India would need to be when their incomes peak, is about the income that the United States had in the year 1890 or so. So in other words, around the same income as the United States had when it was just setting off in earnest in its own industrial revolution. It had just, in other words, realized that its development, its growth, would come from industrialization that was fueled by fossil fuels. Its emissions were increasing at a fairly rapid rate, at the exact same level of development that Indonesia's, India's, certainly the LDCs, will need to be declining. These countries will be faced, in other words, with a dual challenge. One, fulfill the basic needs of their people, develop and provide the basic amenities, and do so while shutting down their existing fossil fuel infrastructure and switching somehow to something else. So given that, let's look at the idea of capability and what it has to do with progressivity and how we might think about that, and what did the Civil Society Coalition that undertook this effort do. What you see here before you are 3 income distribution charts. So what that means is, if you were to line up everybody in the country and we show India here, China, and the US, and line them up with the poorest person on the left and the wealthiest person on the right, and plot their income, you would get an income distribution chart. We've done this for India, for China, and for the US. The India chart is wider, and the China chart is wider than the US's because it merely represents the size of their relative populations. And the information conveyed here is it's in many ways unsurprising. India is significantly poorer than China, which itself is significantly poorer than the United States. Incomes are higher in the US than in China, and higher in China than in India. Another thing that you see on this chart is a level of income, which is about $7,500 per year, or about $20 per day, labeled development threshold. $20 a day, roughly speaking, based on empirical studies that looked across time and across countries, $20 a day is about the income at which people tend to reach developed country levels of standard indicators of poverty. In other words, things have improved to developed country levels with regard to things like life expectancy, infant mortality, access to health care, access to education. And so that's a level at which people start to have additional income beyond what's needed in order to invest in still securing basic goods, basic needs. Income, sort of discretionary income, they can start putting into the consumer purchases that make them part of a global middle class. The portion shaded in kind of tan is, in other words, income below $20 a day. And the portion shaded in the reddish is income earned above $20 a day. And so you can see exactly the size of the population that does earn income above that development threshold of $20 a day in each country. In the United States, it's almost everybody. In China, it's a good 300 million people or so. In India, it's maybe 60 or 70 million people. These are sizable populations. The population of those above this development threshold who are starting to purchase consumer goods in China is as large as the United States population. The population in India that is starting to have income sufficient to make consumer purchases is the size of, say, Germany's population. The sizes of those populations, though, are sort of where the similarity ends. The large population in China that's part of the consumer class is still earning much less than the United States counterparts, and their consumption levels are much less, and their environmental impacts are much less. Similarly with China. With India, the size of the population may be similar to Germany's, but the incomes are much less, roughly a factor of 6 or so less, and the consumption levels and environmental footprints are much lower. The way to think about capacity is typically thought of as reflecting income. A country's capacity is somehow related to its income. Capacity obviously has many different dimensions. There's technological capacity and institutional capacity and political capacity, but all of these are very, very strongly correlated with income. So thinking of income as a basic indicator for capacity is a widely accepted and reasonable thing to do. In order to think of income as an indicator for capacity in a progressive way, a sensible thing to do is to interpret it in the same way that national tax systems do. They tax income at different levels at different rates. Most countries have a level of income below which an individual does not pay taxes, and it only pays taxes on the income above that level. In the United States, it's about $10,100 per person. In many European countries, it's significantly higher than that. What the civil society coalition decided, for the purpose of this analysis, was that one reasonable benchmark for capacity would be to exclude income below this development threshold of $7,500 a day. So it's analogous to a tax code. There's a certain level of income below which income is exempted from the calculation of capacity. But one can also notice that it's a bit less progressive than the United States tax code, in the sense that that exemption is significantly lower than the exemption level of $10,000 that is used in the United States. A second benchmark was considered that was more progressive. Not only was income below that threshold excluded, but income above it progressively counted for more and more. In other words, very much like a tax system where the marginal tax rate increases steadily as incomes increase. There was a third benchmark that the coalition decided to look at also, which used an even lower threshold below which income was excluded, a threshold of only about $6 or $7 per day. Now this is getting toward a very low income, least developed country level of incomes, but again, it was seen to be something that was politically relevant, useful to see what would be the implications for fair shares of even taking a benchmark that was considered outside of an equitable range from the perspective of the civil society groups. So what I've discussed so far are, one, the way that the civil society groups considered an equity range on the historic responsibility side. Second, how the civil society groups considered an equity range on the capacity and progressivity side. And so now what we'll do is we'll go to indicators to show what does this way of looking at equity tell us. And so what we see here is a range of again, representative countries. It shows their share of the total population, global population, as a percentage of the total, their income, again in purchasing power parity terms, what's the actual purchasing power of individual incomes, and then it shows their responsibility as a share, so cumulative emissions since, in this case, 1850, the lower of the two benchmarks, as a share of the global total. So the global total is 100% here, and we see that the United States' share is some 43%. The EU share is some 20%. China's, for example, is, say, 4%. The Annex 1, or developed countries as a whole, is about 80%, and non-Annex 1 about 20%. We also see the capability, in other words, the share of the global income above that development threshold of $20 a day, and considered increasingly progressive above that. The United States' share is about 39%, the EU about 24%, China is about 6%, and developed countries as a whole about 83%. So taking the simplest way of combining these two key equity indicators of responsibility and capability into a combined indicator, we simply average the two. Average the two and come up with a share for each country of the combined responsibility and capability as a share of the global total. The United States, averaging the two, is 41%, and the EU 22%, skipping to China, again 5%, and developed countries as a whole 81%. This is in 2015, given current incomes and emissions as they have been till now. If one looks forward to 2030, when most of these Paris pledges have been put forward for, we see that the shares shift a bit. Using standard projections, again based on the IPCC scenario database medians, we see that the shares of the United States and the EU, for example, have declined a bit. The share for, say, China has risen quite substantially, from 5% in 2015 to 10% in 2030. and that's because its economy is growing faster than developed countries on average. Developed countries as a whole have about 3/4 or 75% of the total, and developing countries about 1/4 of the total. This is based on the benchmarks where we go back to 1850 for reckoning responsibility, and it's the higher progressivity definition of capacity. If we look at these numbers instead, only going back to 1950 for historic responsibility, and the more middle of the road definition of progressivity, where we exclude income below $20 a day, but we don't progressively include income above that at higher rates, the shares for the wealthier countries tend to be lower. 27% for the United States, 22% for the EU, and the shares for the developing countries tend to be higher. Developed countries as a whole are about 67% or 2/3 of the combined responsibility and capability defined by this 1950 and medium progressivity set of benchmarks, and developing countries is about 1/3 or 33%. So that bounds the range that the Civil Society Coalition considered to be an equitable range of fair shares. We also show, just for reference, the range that the Civil Society Group was interested in seeing the implications of, even though it didn't consider part of its equity range, going back only to 1990 for historical responsibility and considering a very low progressivity definition of capacity. In that case, the United States' share of the combined responsibility and capability would be only 21%. China's would rise to 16%. Developed countries as a whole, a bit more than half, but not too much more, at 55%, and developing countries at 45%. So what we see here are a set of numbers derived fairly directly from, first, a conversation about what are the key, contentious, debated equity issues in the climate negotiations, historic responsibility and progressivity, translated into indicators based on emissions and based on income, and then ultimately translated into a combined indicator of responsibility and capability. And so one can take these shares of the combined, of the total responsibility and capability, and say a fair way to allocate the effort, that 35 billion tons of reductions that need to happen in 2030, shown on the one of the first graphs, allocated among countries according to these shares. And so that's what we've done. And this chart shows, for a set of 10 countries or so, 3 bars. The dark green one corresponds to the benchmark where historic responsibility is 1850 and uses higher progressivity. The light green one is the other end of the equity range, 1950 for historic responsibility, and medium progressivity. And the gray bar shows the third benchmark outside of the equity range, but shown for reference, based on 1990 emissions since 1990 for historic responsibility, and a very low progressivity definition of capacity. And they each bar represents the amount of mitigation, the number of tons of mitigation, of emissions reduction that each country would need to undertake if it were to be doing its fair share according to any of those 3 benchmarks of equity. First thing that pops out is that there is quite a range. Between the highest and the lowest, for the United States, for example, the size of the fair share of the effort varies by almost a factor of 2. Goes from about 7 billion tons, 7,000 million tons, to about 13 billion tons. For China, it goes from about 3 and a bit billion tons to more than 5 billion tons. The other thing shown on this chart are the pledges, the Paris pledges that each of these countries put forward. In other words, the amount of mitigation that these countries have offered in the form of their mitigation pledges in their INDCs. If one looks at several of these countries, one sees that the amount of mitigation that they've pledged is actually much, much smaller than their fair share. Looking at the United States, for example, the United States has pledged something like 2 billion tons of mitigation in 2030, compared to a fair share range between, say, 11 and 13 billion tons. And a third benchmark that the civil society coalition at least considered outside of its fair share range, that is still a factor of 3.5 bigger than what the United States has put on the table. For the EU, the situation is similar. For Japan, for Russia indeed, since its pledge doesn't actually reflect any mitigation effort at all. For various other countries, we see that the pledges, the horizontal black lines, get close to or even exceed their fair share of the effort. China's, for example, its pledge implies something on the order of 5 or 6 billion tons of mitigation, and its fair share is in the range of 3 or 4, based on the equity range, and based on the third benchmark is something around 5. Similarly, India, Indonesia, these countries actually seem to have put on the table, have offered to do mitigation that does in fact meet their fair share. There's another thing to be said about this chart, though. If you look at the United States, for example, with a fair share of the mitigation effort in the range of 9 to 13 billion tons of reductions, this is actually bigger, more reductions that are greater in scale than the United States' actual emissions. Emissions are about 6 billion tons. Same for Europe. Emissions are much less than the roughly 7 billion tons that would be its fair share. What this means is that for these countries, the United States, EU, Japan, Russia, it couldn't do its fair share if its fair share had to be done entirely domestically. If its efforts were limited to its own reducing or eliminating its own domestic emissions, it would be unable to do its fair share. This means that in order for these wealthier countries to do their fair share requires them to not only dramatically and ambitiously reduce their emissions domestically, but it would require them also to provide support, financial support, technological support, that enables other countries, poorer countries, to reduce their emissions. To reduce their emissions even further than their fair shares. Because for poorer countries generally, their fair share is less than their emissions, less even than the amount of reductions that would need to happen in those countries if the world globally were to stay on a 2-degree or 1.5-degree pathway. This all actually really follows quite directly from the following observation. If you look across the world and think of the countries that have high responsibility and high capacity, the wealthier countries, and look across the world at the countries whose emissions are now rising, who are starting to get basic energy needs met and are starting to urbanize and build an industrial and infrastructural base. In other words, the countries where it's most important that a low-carbon transition happen, and it's most important that a lot of mitigation effort is actually done. The countries with the responsibility and capability is a largely different set of countries than the countries with the need to reduce their emissions, the countries with the mitigation potential. In such a world, the only way to square that circle is through international cooperation. Countries that have the obligation to act because of their capacity and responsibility need to provide support so that countries that don't have that level of capacity and responsibility, but whose emissions do need to be reduced and whose energy sectors do need to undergo a transition if we are to stay within 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, these countries need to cooperate. That provision of financial and technological support needs to happen so that the emission reductions can happen where they need to. This chart is a reflection of, on aggregate, added up across all the countries. On the left-hand side, what are the fair shares, and on the right-hand side, what has actually been pledged. On the left-hand side, the blue represents the fair shares of the poorer countries, countries whose capacity and responsibility is less than their actual mitigation need. And the green represents the wealthier countries, countries whose capacity and responsibility is a larger share than their mitigation need. And what we see, unsurprisingly, is that the fair shares of the wealthier countries are larger, roughly a factor of 3 larger than those of the poorer countries. What we see on the right is the pledged action, the amount of mitigation pledged in INDCs for poorer countries in blue, about 9 gigatons, which more or less matches their fair share in aggregate. Not that all countries have met their, not that all of the poorer countries have met their fair share, but many of them have, and some have exceeded it. And then in green, the pledged action of the developed countries, around 6 gigatons, which is significantly less than their fair share. And then in gray, the ambition gap, the amount of mitigation that still needs somehow to get done. Some of that mitigation is mitigation that developed countries should certainly do by accelerating their own efforts domestically, but a large share of it is also mitigation that needs to happen through cooperative action, through the provision of financial and technological support from developed countries in developing countries to enable them to undergo a low-carbon transition. Another part of this bar on the right, the blue and gray hatched, represents what's been put forward as conditional pledges by developing countries. In other words, pledges to undertake more mitigation domestically, providing there is sufficient financial and technological support to enable them to undertake that mitigation. In Paris, what's likely to be one of the most important discussions is a more concrete and definitive discussion of how developing countries can come forward with concrete plans and offers for further mitigation, and a clear explanation and elaboration of the type of support they'll need in order to undertake that, finance and technological support. A conversation that happens along with the developed countries, so there can be a meeting of those developed countries that are to provide the support, and the developing countries that will need the support in order to undertake more reductions and to keep us globally within a 2-degree pathway, which we won't be able to do otherwise. Briefly, here's just a graphical representation on a map of the fair shares of a set of countries, the same one shown on the chart with the bars. The gray is the fair share ranging from across the different equity benchmarks, and the red is the size of the mitigation that's been pledged by countries that have not quite met their share. And the relative sizes show how much has been pledged compared to what it would be the size of the fair share. The green are countries that have met their fair shares, compared to gray, the size of their fair shares. Green is the pledged mitigation, and gray is the fair share. And finally, in conclusion, the first point, referring back to the United Nations framework Convention Secretariat study and the United Nations Environment Program study, as well as the Civil Society Equity Review, these three assessments, this triad of INDC, Paris Pledge assessments, all agree we're not on track. Not on track to meet 2 degrees or certainly 1.5 degrees. The upcoming Paris Agreement, if based just on these pledges, won't solve the climate problem. If we're to do so, then countries would need to ratchet up their effort further than the pledges that they've put forward on the table so far. And equity is key if this is to happen. As the IPCC said, if an agreement is fair, it's more likely to actually work. Assessing these Paris pledges, even in a way that spans a range of equity perspectives from a diverse range of civil society groups, and even takes into account perspectives that they wouldn't consider fair, still provides very clear lessons. It lets us know who are the leaders and who are the laggards. For wealthier countries, providing support beyond the reductions, ambitious, dramatic reductions that would need to take place domestically, is part of fulfilling their fair share of the effort. They will not be seen as contributing fairly unless they do so. And for poorer countries, even those who have met their own fair share, much more mitigation in their countries will still need to be done with support through international cooperative action if globally we are to keep emissions within the budget that's needed to keep warming below 2 degrees. So that's all I wanted to formally present, Nathan. But I think we do have some time for questions at least.
Yeah, we do have a very short amount of time. If there are questions coming in on the live stream, which I just checked and there didn't appear to be, I think it's a very content heavy presentation that I'm sure will take a while for people to digest, and it's for that reason that it will be held on YouTube so people can have multiple viewings. I would also just say that we will put in the description of the video the link, the URL for a website, which is what Sivan is presenting in his slides, civilsociettyreview.org. We'll put that in the description as well. There's a lot more graphics, and you can download the full report he's been speaking from that website. I don't see any just now. I'm just checking the Q&A again. Not seeing any. Perhaps I would just ask you, Sivan, if you've mentioned this vast sort of transfer of financial and technological resources that needs to happen in order for certain developed countries to be able to fulfill their fair share internationally rather than domestically. And I wonder, does the report go in a direction towards quantifying what that might be, or giving any indication of the sort of scale that is needed to really fulfill the fair shares?
It discusses that in the sense of trying to look at the various estimates that have been made out there by the IPCC and by others of the total amount of financial resources that will be needed to do the mitigation that's needed, and also to do the adaptation that's needed. There is, I'm showing the report on the screen now, and there's a section on both mitigation finance and on finance for adaptation and loss and damage. And two things can be said. One is that still there is really a rather large span of estimates. Part of the reason for the large span of estimates is that some of them weren't very comprehensive. They looked at specific types of costs and specific sectors. They didn't include the whole range. Another reason why there's a large span of estimates is that there is some fundamental uncertainty still. In 2030, for which these estimates were calculated, we don't really know everything that would need it to be known in order to make those estimates. What will be costs of renewable options then, and what will be the extent of climate impacts for which we need adaptation. But the other thing that we said is that the numbers tend to be significantly larger than the types of numbers that are currently being discussed in the climate negotiations. So out of Copenhagen and Cancun, the figure of $100 billion for both mitigation and adaptation was the one that was that gained the political um, was anchored in those agreements. And by and large, the estimates that are being put forward for mitigation and adaptation reached several hundreds of millions of dollars, and perhaps more than that. And one can understand why. We really are talking about a wholesale, comprehensive transformation of really not just the energy sector, but energy and transport and agriculture and pretty much economies as a whole.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we may wrap it up there. It's getting late, sort of in Europe and definitely in Asia. I think probably our Asian audience will be having to catch up with this on YouTube tomorrow. I do just want to again thank you ever so much, Sivan, for taking time out of your very busy schedule in the run up to Paris to explain some of these things. I wonder if people are interested in further contact with yourself. Do you want to explain how best to do that, or should we leave it to say that people can maybe go through maybe me in order to reach out to you if they have follow-up questions, or if they should just check the website?
Yeah, that would chat box, and people can feel free to contact with questions.
Okay. Brilliant. In that case, unless there's anything urgently popping up from anyone online, I think we'll call it a day and wrap up there. Thanks again to Sivan for joining us. Thanks again to Earth in Brackets for organizing and being the initiative behind this. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And don't forget that we have tomorrow, the third in our series of webinars. We have that with Liddy Napville from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. And she will be speaking, just one second, to the theme of what Southern movements, social movements in the Global South, what their perspectives are on the COP21, and also what some of their demands are, what they're going to Paris in order to advocate for. So that will be on the 19th of November at 1 p.m. GMT. So you can find out what time that is in your time zone and tune in again. We will be posting the links to that on Youngo Facebook pages, on the Youth in UNFCCC Google mailing list, and also in the link to this video as well, so you can follow up again. So that's it. Thanks again for everyone for participating and for joining in, and thanks once again to Sivan Kartha for joining us.
My pleasure, Nathan. Thanks for setting this up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nathan. See you tomorrow.
Bye, everyone.